I'm ashamed to be here. At 59 years old, I never imagined I'd be asking strangers on the internet whether I deserve to spend the rest of my life alone. My wife doesn't even know my name most days, some mornings. She looks at me the way you'd look at a stranger on a bus. Last Tuesday, the only person I thought would stand beside us looked me in the eyes, Dee, and said, "You and Mum are no longer welcome in this house." I couldn't answer because he wasn't just talking to me. He was talking about the woman who taught him how to walk, the woman who stayed awake through every fever, the woman who still smiles every time she hears his name, even though she can no longer remember her own. I haven't stopped hearing those words because every night I ask myself the same question: how did I raise a son who could do this to us? I don't know where to begin. Maybe I should begin with the little boy who used to wait at the front window every evening, because that's the version of him I still see when I close my eyes, not the man who sleeps upstairs now. The little boy. My wife and I spent almost 15 years trying to have a child, 15 years of hospitals, specialists, prayers, and watching friends become parents while we smiled through our own heartbreak. Every month we convinced ourselves, maybe this time. Every month, we folded another piece of disappointment into our lives. Eventually, my wife stopped buying baby clothes. She packed them into a cardboard box and pushed it into the loft. She thought I didn't notice. I noticed. I just didn't know what to say. Then one afternoon, she came home carrying a leaflet she'd picked up by accident. It wasn't even meant for us. It was about adoption. Neither of us said anything for almost an hour. We just sat there, looking at this single piece of paper, as if our entire future had somehow fitted onto one page. 3 months later, we met a little boy called Fred. He didn't run into our arms. He didn't smile. He hid behind a plastic chair, clutching a tiny red toy car with one wheel missing. The social worker whispered, "He doesn't trust people yet." I remember kneeling down, sliding the toy car back toward him after it rolled across the floor. He looked at me, then quietly said the first words he ever spoke to me. "Is that yours now?" I smiled. "No, I think it's always been yours." I didn't know it then, but that little red toy car would stay in our house for more than 30 years. I still have it. Sometimes I hold it in my hand and wonder, was that little boy ever really mine? Or did I just borrow him for a while? I wish I could tell you the first day felt magical. It didn't. It was awkward. He barely looked at us. On the drive home, he sat in the back seat clutching that little red toy car. Not once did he ask where we were going. Not once did he ask who we were. He just stared out of the window, like he'd already learned that adults don't always stay. That broke my heart more than anything. The social worker had warned us. Don't expect him to call you Mom and Dad. Don't expect hugs. Don't expect trust. Trust takes time. She was right. The first night, we left his bedroom door open. We thought it would help him feel safe. At about 2 o'clock in the morning, I woke up because I heard tiny footsteps in the hallway. I found him sitting outside our bedroom, curled up against the wall, still holding that little red toy car. I asked, "Fred, what's wrong?" He looked at the floor, then quietly said, "If I go to sleep, will you still be here tomorrow?" I don't think I've ever recovered from that question. I carried him back to bed, tucked him in, and before I switched off the light, I made him a promise. I said, "As long as I have breath in my body, you will never wake up wondering where your parents went." I kept that promise every single day, or at least I thought I did. He was 6. We were walking home from the park. He slipped his hand into mine, completely without thinking. Then he looked up at me and said, "Dad." He stopped walking. His face turned white. "I'm sorry. Was I allowed to call you that?" I couldn't speak. I just knelt down, hugged him, and cried. Because for the first time in my life, somebody had trusted me enough to call me Dad then. If I'd known that one word would eventually tear our family apart, I would have held on to that moment forever. People sometimes ask couples without children what they spend their money on. I smile when I hear that, because after Fred came into our lives, we never had money. We had plans. Every decision became, will this make his future better? We built our business one customer at a time. Some weeks I worked 7 days. My wife handled the books during the day, then stayed up until midnight helping me prepare orders for the next morning. We weren't chasing luxury, we were chasing security. We wanted one little boy to grow up never worrying about tomorrow. By the time Fred turned 16, the business had become more successful than we'd ever imagined. We moved into the biggest house we'd ever seen. I remember standing in the empty hallway before the furniture arrived. My wife laughed and said, "Imagine little Fred racing down these stairs every Christmas morning." And that's exactly what he did. Every Christmas, he'd run downstairs before sunrise, pretending he wasn't excited, even when he was nearly 18. My wife used to leave one present unopened. She'd always tell him, "This one's from Mom and Dad." He never opened that present first. He always saved it until last. I asked him why once. He smiled. "Because the best ones should be opened slowly." Funny. I still think about that sentence, because sometimes the things you open slowly hurt the most. There's something I've never admitted to anyone, not even to my wife. Looking back, I think the biggest mistake we ever made came from love. Not selfishness, love. We promised each other that Fred would never feel different, never feel unwanted, never wonder whether he belonged. So we made a decision I defended for more than 20 years. We locked every adoption document away, told the agency we didn't want any contact, removed every reminder we could find. We convinced ourselves that if nobody ever spoke about the adoption, then one day it would simply stop existing. Looking back now, I don't know whether we were protecting our son or protecting ourselves, because some truths don't disappear. They wait, and ours waited almost 30 years. For a long time, I believed we'd beaten life, not because we were rich, because we were happy. Fred went to university, came back every Sunday for lunch, even when he was old enough to have his own life. He never forgot ours. My wife would spend Saturday evening cooking his favorite meal, shepherd's pie. She always made too much. She'd laugh and say, "He'll ask for seconds." He always did. Sometimes I'd catch him looking around the dining room, smiling at the family photographs on the wall, holidays, birthdays, Christmas mornings, school uniforms, graduation, 30 years of memories hanging side by side. One afternoon, I asked him, "If you could change anything about your childhood, what would it be?" He didn't even think. He smiled, then said, "Nothing. You and Mom gave me everything." Looking back, I think that was the last time I truly believed him, because life has a strange way of letting you enjoy the view. Just before the cliff, my wife was 58 when she forgot where she'd parked the car. We laughed. She laughed louder than I did. "I'm getting old," she said. A few weeks later, she forgot my birthday. That had never happened before. Then, she left the oven on. Then, she called our neighbor by her sister's name. Little things, the kind of things people explain away, until they can't. The consultant didn't speak immediately. He folded his hands, looked at both of us, then quietly said, "I'm afraid it's early onset dementia." I didn't hear anything after the word dementia. My wife reached across the desk, took my hand, and smiled. "Don't worry. We'll get through it." She was comforting me on the day she should have been comforting herself. That's who she was. I promised her, "You'll never face this alone." I meant every word. I just didn't realize someone else would decide whether I could keep that promise. Dementia changes everything. Not all at once. One responsibility at a time. My wife had always managed the accounts. I couldn't care for her and run the business. Something had to give. Fred was 30, smart, hardworking, loyal, or so I believed. One evening, we sat in my office, just the two of us. I unlocked the cabinet, took out a small leather folder. Inside were the business documents, the bank authorizations, the property records, everything we'd spent 30 years building. I slid the folder across the desk. He stared at it, then looked at me. "Dad, are you sure?" I laughed. "Son, there's nobody else I'd trust." He stood up, walked around the desk, hugged me. A proper hug, the kind that makes a father think everything is going to be all right. Sometimes I replay that hug in my mind because I still can't decide whether I was embracing my son or handing everything I loved to the man who would eventually take it from us. If you're expecting me to tell you that everything changed the moment I handed Fred those documents, it didn't. That's the dangerous thing about trust. It doesn't disappear overnight. It disappears so slowly that by the time you realize it's gone, you've already built your whole life on it. For almost 2 years, Fred was everything I'd hoped he'd become. He grew the business, paid every supplier on time, never missed a tax deadline. Staff respected him, customers liked him. Every Friday evening, he'd come home, sit beside his mom, tell her stories about the week, even on the day she couldn't remember what day it was. She always remembered his smile. Sometimes she'd hold his face in both hands and say, "You're a good man." He'd laugh, kiss her forehead, and answer, "Only because you and Dad taught me how." Looking back, those words haunt me more than the cruel ones, because I still don't know whether he meant them when he said them, or whether something happened later that changed him forever. The first warning wasn't about money. It wasn't about the business. It wasn't even about my wife. It was a cup of tea. One Saturday afternoon, my wife was having one of her better days. She insisted on making tea for all three of us. Fred smiled, sat at the kitchen table, waited patiently while she wandered from cupboard to cupboard, forgetting what she'd gone there for. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Eventually, she came back carrying 3 empty mugs. She looked embarrassed, then quietly whispered, "I've forgotten how to make it." Before I could stand up, Fred was already beside her. He wrapped one arm around her shoulders and said, "Then we'll learn together." My wife cried. I cried too, not because she couldn't remember, but because I thought we were gonna survive this as a family. Looking back, I think that's why I ignored the one thing that happened before he left that evening. Looking back, I don't think Fred ever came searching for the truth. The truth found him. Every Friday, no matter how busy work became, he'd stop by after the office. Sometimes he'd stay 20 minutes, sometimes 2 hours. It depended on how Mom was feeling that day. Dementia is a strange illness. Some afternoons, she couldn't remember what she'd eaten for breakfast. Then, without warning, she'd tell stories from 30 years ago, as though they'd happened that morning. Fred never rushed her. He'd sit beside her on the sofa, listening, laughing, filling in the parts she couldn't quite remember. I used to stand in the kitchen, watching them through the doorway, thinking, we must have done something right. Then one evening, I went outside to trim the hedge. They were still talking when I left. 20 minutes, maybe 30. I can't remember exactly, but I remember the silence when I came back inside. The television was still on. The kettle had boiled dry. Fred was gone. My wife was sitting perfectly still, staring at the family photographs. I asked, "Where's Fred?" She looked at me, confused, then said, "He got upset." My stomach tightened. "Why?" She frowned, as if she was trying to pull a dream back into focus. Then she smiled, the way she used to when she was remembering happier days. "We were talking about the day we brought him home." She paused. "From the adoption center." My heart stopped before I could say a word. She looked at me, completely bewildered. "Did we never tell him?" I don't remember answering. I only remember running to the front door. hoping I'd catch him before he drove away. But his car was already gone. That was the moment our 30-year secret stopped belonging to us. For 30 years, Sunday lunch wasn't something we planned. It was simply what our family did. No invitations, no messages. Around 1 o'clock, Fred would walk through the front door, let himself in, and shout, "Something smells good." My wife would always pretend to be annoyed. At least say hello before asking what's for lunch. He'd laugh, kiss her on the cheek, then steal a roast potato before she'd finish serving. It happened so many times. We stopped noticing it. Funny. The moments you think will last forever are usually the ones you never stop to appreciate. The Sunday after she told him, we laid the table for 3, just like always. My wife folded his favorite napkin, the blue one. She couldn't remember what she'd had for breakfast, but somehow she still remembered which napkin Fred liked. 1 o'clock came, then 1:30, then 2. I rang him, straight to voicemail. I told myself he was busy. Work sometimes ran late. My wife kept glancing toward the window every few minutes. "He's coming," she whispered. I smiled. Of course he is. By 4 o'clock, the roast was cold. My wife quietly wrapped his untouched plate and put it in the fridge. She looked at me and asked, "Has he forgotten where we live?" I wanted to tell her no. Instead, I lied. "He'll be here next Sunday." That night, I realized something I'd never had to learn before. Sometimes, hope hurts more than the truth, because every sound outside the house still made me believe my son had finally come home. The second Sunday, I didn't cook as much. I told myself there was no point wasting food, but I still set out 3 plates. My wife noticed. She always noticed. "Has he been working too hard?" she asked. I nodded. "That's all it is?" She smiled. "He's always worked too hard." Every excuse I made for Fred became another lie I told my wife, because I couldn't bear to watch dementia steal one more thing from her. She had already forgotten birthdays, forgotten neighbors, forgotten where she left her glasses. I couldn't let her believe she'd also lost her son. So every evening, I'd tell her, "He called today. He's just busy. He asked how you were." Sometimes she'd smile. Sometimes she'd cry. Sometimes she'd ask, "Did I upset him?" That question broke me every single time, because she couldn't remember the conversation. But somewhere deep inside, she remembered the feeling that something had gone terribly wrong. I kept saying, "None of this is your fault." Looking back, I wish I'd said those words to myself as well, because I was about to discover that silence can damage a family just as much as lies. It was 5 days later, just after 7 in the evening. My phone vibrated. I looked down and saw Fred's name. For a moment, I smiled. I actually thanked God out loud. The message was only one sentence. "Dad, can we meet tomorrow? Just you and me." No kiss, no smile, no "love you." Just one sentence. I read it again, then again. I don't know why, but something about it made my stomach tighten. I showed it to my wife. She smiled. "See? I told you he'd come back." I smiled too, but it wasn't relief. It was fear. Because after 30 years of hearing my son say, "Dad," I suddenly realized I had no idea what he was about to call me next. I arrived 10 minutes early. He was already sitting there. Same corner table. Same cafe we'd been coming to for years. The waitress smiled when she saw me. "Your son's here already." I smiled back. Funny how ordinary the world can look on the day your life quietly changes forever. Fred stood up when I walked over. We hugged. It wasn't cold. It wasn't warm either. It felt careful, like two people trying not to break something they couldn't yet see. He asked how Mum was. I told him she'd had a good morning. We spoke about work, about football, about the weather, the sort of conversation strangers have when they're both avoiding the only thing that matters. Then he wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. looked down, and quietly asked, "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Anything." He nodded, took a slow breath, then looked me straight in the eyes. "Have you ever lied to me because you thought it was for my own good?"
I've replayed that moment thousands of times, not because of what I said, because of what I didn't. I could have told him everything, right there, before the silence grew teeth, before doubt became certainty, before love became suspicion. But fear has a way of disguising itself as protection. So instead, I asked him, "Why would you ask me that?" He didn't answer immediately. He reached into his jacket, took out his wallet, opened it. Inside was an old photograph, one I'd seen 1,000 times. The day we brought him home, Mom was crying. I was smiling so hard my cheeks hurt. Fred was holding that little red toy car with the missing wheel. He slid the photograph across the table, then quietly said, "Mom looked at this picture the other day and said, 'That's the day we finally got to bring you home.'" He swallowed. Then she said, "I still can't believe they trusted us with you." He looked at me. His eyes weren't angry. They were frightened. "Dad, what did she mean?" I stared at that photograph, then back at my son. 30 years of promises. 30 years of love. 30 years of fear were sitting between us on that little cafe table. I wish I could tell you that I did the brave thing. I wish I could tell you that I reached across the table, took his hand, and finally gave him the truth he deserved all along. But I didn't. I looked at my son and said, "Your mom gets confused sometimes. She mixes memories together. You know what dementia's like." He didn't interrupt me. He didn't argue. He just listened. Then he nodded once, folded the photograph, put it back into his wallet, finished the last sip of his coffee, stood up, and said, "I understand." Then he hugged me, just like always. But this time, he held on for only a second. As he walked away, I remember thinking, thank God he believed me. Looking back now, I think that was the moment he stopped asking me for the truth and started looking for it somewhere else. After that meeting, I expected everything to return to normal. Funny how easy it is to mistake postponing the truth for saving the people you love. The next Friday, he didn't visit. Then the Friday after that, I rang him. He answered. We spoke for less than a minute. He wasn't rude. He wasn't angry. He simply sounded elsewhere, like someone speaking to me, while their mind was standing in another room. "Everything all right?" I asked. "Yeah, work's just been busy." "How's Mom?" "She's okay. Tell her I love her." Then he hung up. That sentence should have comforted me. Instead, it frightened me, because for the first time in 30 years, my son sounded like a man trying to convince himself. More than he was trying to convince me. I didn't know where he was spending his evenings anymore. But I would soon discover he wasn't looking for me. He was looking for someone I'd spent 30 years making sure he could never find. A few days later, the post landed on the mat. Among the usual bills was a plain white envelope. My name wasn't on it. Fred's was. I recognized the logo immediately. The adoption agency. For a second, I just stood there, holding it. 30 years earlier, I'd signed a form asking for no future contact. I believed that piece of paper would close one chapter forever. Instead, it had simply delayed the next one. I phoned Fred. He answered after the third ring. "You've got a letter." There was a long silence. Then he quietly said, "I know." I asked them to send it. I felt something inside me sink. "Fred, please, can we talk before you open it?" Another silence. Then, "Dad, I needed you to tell me." "You didn't." Now I have to let strangers do it instead. He ended the call. I stood there, still holding the envelope. It weighed almost nothing, yet somehow, it felt heavier than every box we'd ever carried into that house. Some letters don't arrive to give you answers. They arrive to tell you that you've already run out of time. He never told me what it said. I never asked. Not because I didn't want to know. Because I was afraid that whatever was written inside had already replaced 30 years of memories. For a while, nothing happened. At least, nothing anyone else would notice. He still answered my calls, still asked how his mom was, still said, "Love you, Dad." But something had changed. Love had become careful, measured, as though every conversation now carried a question neither of us dared ask. Looking back, I don't think the letter made him stop loving us. I think it made him start grieving people who were still alive. Sometimes the hardest funeral you'll ever attend is for the family you thought you had.
A month later, Fred asked if we could look at the business accounts together. Nothing unusual, we'd done it dozens of times. He showed me spreadsheets, rising costs, lower profits, inflation, staff wages. He spoke calmly, logically. Then he looked at me and said, "Dad, I think we should reduce the amount we transfer into your personal account every month." I laughed. "You don't have to explain yourself. You're running things now." He smiled, but it never reached his eyes. Driving home, I kept telling myself he was making a business decision, a sensible one, a responsible one. That's what fathers do. We explain our children's decisions, even when our hearts don't understand them. I didn't realize that wasn't the last thing he'd start taking away. It was the first. Every day, a carer comes to help with my wife. Just 3 hours, long enough for me to shop or sleep or simply sit in the garden and remember what silence felt like. One Tuesday, she didn't come. I thought she'd been delayed. I rang the agency. The woman on the phone sounded confused. "Mr. Harris? We were told the service had been cancelled." My stomach dropped. "By who?" There was a pause. Then she quietly said, "Your son." I didn't believe her. I couldn't. I phoned Fred immediately. "Dad? It was costing thousands every month. You're home with Mum anyway." I thought it made sense. I wanted to shout. Instead, I simply said, "Next time, please tell me first." There was another silence. Then he answered, "I thought I was helping." After we hung up, I stood in the hallway, looking at the empty driveway. Funny, you never realize how much strength another person quietly gives you until they stop arriving. That afternoon, I looked after my wife completely alone for the first time. After Fred stopped coming home, my wife changed. Not overnight. Dementia rarely does anything overnight. It steals people, one small piece at a time. She began asking about Fred every morning. "Has he been?" I'd smile. "Not yet." An hour later, she'd ask again. "Has he forgotten us?" I'd tell her, "He's working." She always accepted the answer. For about 5 minutes, then she'd ask again. Some afternoons, she'd stand at the living room window, looking down the driveway, smiling whenever headlights passed the house. Every time. She thought it was him. Every time. It wasn't. The hardest part wasn't watching her forget. It was watching her remember the one person who wasn't there. Then one evening, she looked at me and quietly asked, "Did I do something to make our boy stop loving me?" I opened my mouth, but no words came, because no husband should ever have to answer that question. That night, I cried in the bathroom so she wouldn't hear me. People think dementia is forgetting names. It isn't. Dementia is waking up beside the person you've loved for 40 years and seeing fear in their eyes. It happened just after 2 in the morning. I heard footsteps upstairs.
Then cupboards opening. I found her standing in the hallway, still wearing her nightdress, holding her handbag. "Where are you going?" I asked. She looked straight at me and stepped backwards. "Please, don't come any closer." I felt my heart stop. "Love, it's me." She shook her head. Tears filled her eyes. "I want my son." I couldn't speak. I just stood there, watching the woman I'd spent my whole life loving become frightened of the man she'd promised forever to. 20 minutes later, she suddenly looked at me, blinked, and whispered, "Why are you crying?" She didn't remember. I did. I always will. The next morning, I rang Fred. I didn't ask him for money. I asked him to please come home and see his mom. I believe seeing him might help her settle a bit. He didn't answer. 3 days later, a car pulled onto the driveway. I recognized it immediately. Before I'd even opened the front door, my wife had already seen it through the window. She smiled, a real smile, the kind I hadn't seen for weeks. Our boy's home. She hurried toward the hallway, as quickly as dementia would let her. I opened the door. Fred stood there, smiling, but he wasn't alone. Beside him was a woman I'd never met. She held his hand. He looked at me, almost nervously, then said, "Dad, there's someone I'd like you and Mom to meet." I smiled, because despite everything, I still believed this visit might be the beginning of us finding each other again. I had no idea. We just opened the front door to the next chapter of losing our family. I wish I could tell you that I disliked her from the moment we met. It would make the story much easier to understand. But the truth is, I liked her. She shook my hand with both of hers, brought flowers for your mom, called me Mr. Harris, then apologized when I asked her to call me Dad instead. My wife adored her immediately. She kept asking, "Is this our daughter?" We'd laugh, correct her. 5 minutes later, she'd ask again, and every single time, that young woman smiled and answered as though it was the first time she'd heard the question. I remember watching her, thinking, maybe she's exactly what this family needs. Before they left, Fred hugged me, then quietly said, "She's good for me." I smiled. I can see that. Looking back, I wasn't wrong. She was good for him. I just never imagined that what was good for him would slowly become unbearable for us. They started visiting more often, sometimes after work, sometimes at weekends. At first, I looked forward to it. The house felt alive again. Laughter echoed through rooms that had grown far too quiet. My wife smiled more, even on the difficult days. Then, I began noticing little things. Nothing worth arguing about. Just little things. She'd quietly open a window after my wife walked through the room. She always carried a small bottle of hand sanitizer in her handbag. If my wife repeated the same story 5 times, her smile became a little harder each time. One afternoon, my wife accidentally knocked over a cup of tea. She froze, embarrassed. Before I could fetch a cloth, she was already wiping it up. She smiled at my wife, then softly said, "It's all right." My wife looked at her, smiled apologetically, and whispered, "I'm so sorry. I don't seem to get things right anymore." My heart broke hearing those words, because the woman apologizing was the same woman who had once held our whole family together. But as she stood up, I heard her whisper to him, so quietly, she probably thought I couldn't hear. She really shouldn't be left on her own anymore. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't said with anger. It sounded like concern. And maybe she was right. But for some reason, it stayed with me. Because I realized something in that moment. She wasn't looking at my wife the way I still did. She wasn't seeing the woman who built our home, who stayed awake through fevers, who taught Fred to read, who never missed a school play. She was seeing a patient. And once the person you love becomes a patient in someone else's eyes, it's only a matter of time before they start making decisions about a life that isn't theirs to remember. That night, after they'd gone home, my wife was having one of her rare clear evenings. Those moments had become precious. You never knew how long they'd last. Sometimes 10 minutes, sometimes an hour. Then the fog would come back and take her somewhere I couldn't follow. We sat together in the conservatory, just the two of us, watching the rain slide slowly down the glass. Neither of us said much. After 40 years together, we'd learned that silence could sometimes say more than words ever could. Then she reached across, took my hand, and smiled. "Promise me something," I laughed. "You've never had to ask twice." She smiled, but this time it didn't reach her eyes. She squeezed my hand, harder than she'd managed in months. "If my mind disappears," she stopped, closed her eyes, searching for words that dementia kept stealing from her. Then she whispered, "Don't let them put me somewhere strange." My chest tightened. She looked embarrassed, almost guilty, as though she'd asked me for something impossible. "I know I'll be difficult. I know I'll forget things. Maybe one day. I'll even forget you." I shook my head before she could finish, but she gently placed her hand on my cheek. "Please, let me finish." Tears filled my eyes. She smiled. The same smile I'd fallen in love with 40 years earlier. "I don't want to wake up, surrounded by strangers, thinking everyone I love has left me. If I still have one familiar face, I think I'll be less frightened." I couldn't stop crying. I took both of her hands in mine, kissed them, and said, "As long as I'm breathing, you'll come home to me every night. I promise." She rested her head against my shoulder. Neither of us spoke again. We just listened to the rain. Looking back, I don't think she was asking me to save her memory. I think she already knew. That couldn't be saved. She was asking me to protect her dignity, and I gave her my word. I had no idea that keeping that promise would eventually cost me my son and force me to choose between the two people I loved most in this world. About 2 months later, Fred rang me on a Tuesday evening. He sounded happier than he had in months. "Dad, we've been thinking. It doesn't make sense paying rent when this house has so many empty rooms." I looked around the kitchen. He wasn't wrong. Since the business started doing well, we'd bought a bigger house than two people ever really needed. Most of the bedrooms stayed closed. "Just for a little while," he said, "until we save enough to buy our own place." I looked across at my wife. She was sitting in the lounge, folding the same tea towel for the 4th time. I smiled. "Your mom would love that." He laughed. I thought she might. The following Saturday, they arrived with a car full of suitcases. I carried the heavier boxes upstairs. Fred's partner thanked me over and over again. She even hugged my wife and said, "We'll all look after each other now." Standing in the hallway, watching our family under one roof again, I remember thinking, maybe this is how broken things begin to heal. I didn't realize some people move into your home slowly, long before you notice you're the one who's being moved out. At first, the changes were sensible. A new kettle, different curtains, a larger dining table. Fred's partner would smile and say, "I'm just trying to make things easier for everyone." She wasn't rude. She always asked first, at least in the beginning. Then one afternoon, I came home from buying groceries. The photograph of our wedding, the one that had sat above the fireplace for almost 40 years, was gone. In its place, was a framed print she'd bought online. I asked where our photograph was. She smiled. I wrapped it carefully. I didn't want it getting damaged. I nodded. It sounded reasonable. Later that night, I found it leaning against the wall in the spare bedroom, still wrapped in newspaper. Funny. Nobody threw anything away. They simply started deciding what deserved to be seen. Looking back, that photograph wasn't the first thing to disappear. It was the first thing I noticed. Dementia has a way of stealing dignity long before it steals life. Some mornings, my wife forgot where the bathroom was. Other mornings, she forgot she'd already been. We'd have accidents, more often than either of us wanted. She'd apologize, over and over again, as though saying sorry could undo an illness. I'd tell her the same thing every time. You never have to apologize to me. One evening, Fred's partner walked into the kitchen. She stopped for a moment, opened the back door, then quietly sprayed air freshener. She didn't know I was standing in the hallway. She wasn't trying to be cruel. She just looked tired, overwhelmed. When she turned and saw me, her face dropped. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I didn't mean..." I smiled. "It's all right." But it wasn't. Not because she'd opened the door, because for the first time, I realized something I'd spent months refusing to admit. This house no longer smelt like home. It smelt like illness. And illness has a way of changing how people look at the places they live. That evening, I overheard a conversation upstairs. One that made me realize the promise I'd made to my wife was about to be tested. That evening, I was carrying the washing upstairs. Halfway up, I heard voices coming from Fred's room. They weren't arguing. They were talking quietly. The sort of conversation people have when they think they're being sensible. I wasn't trying to listen, but then I heard my wife's name. So I stopped. Fred's partner sighed. "She can't keep living like this." Fred didn't answer straight away. Then he quietly said, "I know." She spoke again. "Neither can your dad." There was another silence. Then she whispered, "He's exhausted. He's just too proud to admit it." I stood there, holding a basket of washing, listening to strangers discuss the life I'd spent 40 years building. Then Fred said something I'll never forget. Maybe a care home would be kinder. I nearly dropped the basket. Kinder. That one word echoed in my head all night. Because to him, it meant safety. To me, it meant breaking the last promise I'd ever made to my wife. For the first time, I realized we weren't fighting over a building. We were fighting over what love looked like. 2 weeks later, our social worker came for her routine visit. She'd known my wife for nearly a year. She was patient, gentle, never rushed her. My wife liked her, which wasn't easy anymore. Dementia had made her suspicious of almost everyone. We all sat together in the lounge. Me, my wife, Fred, his partner, the social worker. For most of the visit, we spoke about medication, falls, sleeping, eating. Then, Fred cleared his throat. He looked at the social worker, then at me. "I've been thinking, maybe Mom would have a better quality of life in residential care." The room became very quiet. I looked at my wife. She wasn't following the conversation anymore. She was stroking the arm of her chair, humming softly to herself, completely unaware that the biggest decision of her life was being discussed around her. The social worker nodded slowly. "It's certainly something families often have to consider." Then she turned to me. "How do you feel about that?" I didn't answer immediately, because I wasn't trying to win an argument. I was trying to keep a promise. I finally said, "She asked me not to let her end up somewhere unfamiliar." The social worker smiled kindly. "I understand. But sometimes love means accepting that one person can't do everything alone. I looked at Fred. He nodded, as though he'd already made his decision. That was the first time. I realized I might become the only person left fighting for the promise I'd made. That night, my wife had fallen asleep. I stood there for a while, watching her breathe. Then I quietly closed the bedroom door. Downstairs, Fred was sitting alone in the living room. The television was on, but the sound was muted. He looked up when he saw me. Is Mom asleep? I nodded. Then I said, "Can we talk?" He switched the television off immediately. I sat opposite him. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, I took a deep breath. "I heard what you said upstairs." He didn't pretend he didn't know what I meant. He simply lowered his eyes. "Dad, we're worried about you." I smiled, not because I was happy, but because I suddenly realized he thought this conversation was about me. "I'm not asking about me," I said quietly. "I'm asking about your mom." He rubbed his hands together, the same thing he used to do before exams when he was a boy. "She's getting worse." I nodded. "I know. You can't keep doing this on your own." "I know. You barely sleep." "I know." He looked at me, almost pleading. "Then why won't you even think about another option?" I looked towards the staircase. Even though she couldn't hear us, I lowered my voice, because I gave her my word. Fred closed his eyes. Then he whispered something that I don't think he realized would stay with me forever. "Dad, you made that promise before you knew how bad this would become." The room fell silent. Because for the first time, I realized my son wasn't asking me to break my promise. He genuinely believed some promises are allowed to change. I believed some promises are the only things that should never change. After that night, we never finished the conversation. Fred simply nodded, said, "I understand." Then he went upstairs, but something changed between us. Not all at once, quietly, like a crack spreading through glass. He stopped asking how I was coping. Instead, he'd ask practical questions. "Has Mom taken her medication? Has she eaten today?" Every question made sense. Every question came from concern. Yet somehow, I missed hearing, "How are you, Dad?" Sometimes I'd catch him watching me. The same way a doctor watches a patient, measuring, assessing, worrying. I wasn't just his father anymore. I was becoming another problem he felt responsible for solving. And I don't think either of us noticed. The day we stopped talking as father and son, and started talking as two men who believed they were protecting the same woman, that should have frightened me. Instead, I convinced myself love would be enough to fix it. A few days later, I was sorting through the Morning Post, mostly bills, a supermarket leaflet, one hospital appointment. Then I found an envelope addressed to Fred. It had been delivered here by mistake. I wasn't going to open it. I simply carried it to his room. The door was open. He wasn't inside. I placed the envelope on his desk. That's when I noticed another envelope, already opened, half hidden beneath a notebook. Across the top, in bold letters, I saw the words, "Residential Care Assessment." I froze. I didn't touch it. I didn't read another word. I couldn't. My stomach turned, because until that moment, we'd only talked about possibilities. But that piece of paper told me something different. Someone had already started making plans, and nobody had asked the woman whose life those plans would change. That evening, I waited until we were alone. I didn't accuse him. I didn't raise my voice. I simply asked, "Fred, have you already started looking at care homes?" He looked at me for a long time. Then he quietly answered, "Yes." No excuses, no lies, just one word. I nodded. It hurt, but I respected his honesty. Then I asked him something I've wondered about every day since. "Did you ever intend to tell me?" His eyes filled with tears. He looked away. Then he said, "I wanted to. I just didn't know how." I believed him. That's what made it so painful. Because my son wasn't hiding things to hurt me. He was hiding them because he already knew they would. And that was the moment I realized. The hardest conversations aren't the ones where people shout. They're the ones where everyone tells the truth. And nobody leaves feeling understood. A week passed. Nobody mentioned care homes again. Life settled back into its strange routine. Breakfast, medication, washing, hospital appointments. The sort of days that all blur into one when you're caring for someone you love. I started believing maybe we'd found our way back. Then one Tuesday morning, I walked into the kitchen. Fred was standing by the calendar, pen in his hand. He'd written something in the following Thursday. I didn't think much of it until I read the words. Care home visit, 11 a.m. I stared at the calendar. Fred turned around. He immediately knew what I'd seen. Neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked, "What's this?" He answered quietly, "I just wanted to look. It doesn't mean we've decided anything." I looked back at the calendar, then at him. "We?" He frowned. "What do you mean?" I swallowed. "You said we. When exactly did we decide this was our decision to make?" His face fell. For a second, he looked like my little boy again. Then he said, "Dad, someone has to." Those 3 words stayed with me, because I'd spent 40 years believing I was that someone. I walked out of the kitchen, not because I was angry, because I suddenly wasn't sure where I belonged in my own family anymore. 2 days later, the house phone rang. I answered it without thinking. A cheerful voice said, "Good morning. I'm just calling to confirm tomorrow's visit." I frowned. "I'm sorry. Which visit?" There was a brief silence. Then she replied, "The residential home tour." My stomach tightened. "I think you've got the wrong person." She checked the details, then said, "No, this is the correct address. Your son arranged it." I couldn't speak. She carried on explaining dates, times, parking, what to expect. I don't remember any of it, because all I could think was, Fred hadn't just been thinking about it anymore. He'd started making appointments without telling me. I thanked her, put the phone down. Then I sat alone at the kitchen table. The kettle boiled, then switched itself off. I never made the tea. For the first time in my life, I asked myself a question I never thought I'd have to ask. Was my own son slowly taking my wife away from me? Or was he trying to save both of us from something I refused to see? The next morning, nobody mentioned the phone call. I didn't either. I wanted to believe. Maybe there'd been some misunderstanding. Around 10 o'clock, Fred came into the kitchen. He picked up his car keys, then smiled at me. "Dad, we're going out for a couple of hours." I looked at him, then at my wife. She was sitting by the window, folding a handkerchief she'd already folded 3 times. "Where are you taking her?" I asked. Fred hesitated. Just for a second. Then he answered, "Nowhere important." My stomach tightened. "Tell me." He looked at the floor. "We're just having a look." I knew exactly what he meant. She doesn't even know where she's going. My voice was calm, calmer than I felt. Fred looked at me, his eyes full of exhaustion. "That's why we're going now." I stared at him. "You want to choose her future without her even knowing she's choosing it?" Nobody spoke. Then my wife looked up, smiled at us both, and asked, "Are we going somewhere nice?" Fred forced a smile. "Yes, Mom. Somewhere nice." She clapped her hands, like an excited little girl, and in that moment, I realized dementia hadn't just taken away her memories, it had taken away her voice. And once someone loses their voice, other people start speaking for them. I watched them drive away. My wife waved through the passenger window, smiling. She thought they were taking her on a day out. I stood at the front door. Long after the car disappeared, the house was silent. I'd wanted to go with them, but Fred had quietly said, "It'll be easier if it's just us." Easier, that word again. I walked back inside. Every room felt different. My wife's cardigan was still hanging over the back of her chair. Her reading glasses were on the windowsill. A cup of tea sat on the kitchen counter, half finished, already cold. It looked like she'd simply stepped outside. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had already been taken from us. I kept looking at the clock, every few minutes, wondering what they were showing her, wondering what they were saying, wondering whether she was asking for me. That was the longest 2 hours of my life. Nothing prepares you for waiting at home while someone else decides the future of the person you love most. Just after lunchtime, the car pulled back onto the driveway. I was already opening the front door, before Fred had even switched off the engine. I helped my wife out of the car. She smiled at me, kissed my cheek, then said, "We had such a lovely morning." I searched her face. "Where did you go?" She frowned, thought about it, then laughed. "Oh, I can't remember." She walked inside, humming softly to herself, leaving me standing beside the car with Fred. Neither of us moved. Finally, I asked him, "Did she like it?" He nodded. "She seemed peaceful." I closed my eyes. "She doesn't even know where she's been." Fred's voice cracked. "Maybe that's a kindness, Dad." I looked at my son, really looked at him. He wasn't trying to win. He looked heartbroken, tired, frightened, like a little boy carrying a burden that was too heavy for him. And that's what made it hurt the most. Because for the first time, I realized we were no longer fighting each other. We were both fighting the same illness. The tragedy was, it was slowly teaching us to stand on opposite sides of the battlefield. A few mornings later, my wife woke before dawn. She didn't recognize the bedroom. She thought someone had broken into the house. She screamed, loud enough to wake everyone. I rushed to her. She looked terrified. She pushed me away. "Don't touch me," she cried. "Where's my husband?" Those words hurt more than I can describe. Because I was standing right in front of her. Fred came running upstairs. His partner followed. Together, we spent almost an hour trying to calm her down. Eventually, she recognized my voice. Not my face, my voice. She reached for my hand, then began crying. "I'm sorry. I'm trying so hard." I held her. I know you are." Nobody else spoke. We all just stood there. 4 people, losing the same woman, in 4 different ways. After that morning, the conversation about care stopped being theoretical. It became urgent. The rest of that day, nobody mentioned what had happened. My wife slept for most of the afternoon. When she was awake, she seemed embarrassed, as though she knew she'd frightened us, even if she couldn't remember why. The house was unusually quiet. Nobody turned the television on. Nobody talked about dinner. We all moved around each other, like people walking through a church. Late that evening, Fred asked if we could sit down. His partner made us all a cup of tea, then quietly left the room. It was just me and my son. He wrapped both hands around his mug, but never took a sip. Finally, he looked at me. "Dad, I was frightened this morning." I nodded. "So was I." He stared into his tea. I thought we'd lost her. I looked towards the hallway, listening to make sure my wife was still asleep. Then I quietly said, "Not yet." Fred looked back at me. His eyes were red. "I don't think we can keep pretending love is enough anymore." I knew exactly what he meant. I also knew exactly what I was going to say. As long as she's breathing, she stays in this house. Fred didn't argue. He simply nodded. But there was something different about that nod. It wasn't agreement. It was acceptance. Acceptance that if he couldn't change my mind, he'd have to find another way. A few days passed. Neither of us mentioned that conversation again. We spoke about shopping, medication, hospital appointments, the weather, everything, except the one thing sitting between us. One afternoon, I came back from the garden. The back door was open. I could hear Fred talking in the kitchen. He said quietly, "But I don't think he understands how serious this has become." Those words hit me harder than I expected. Not because he thought I was wrong, but because he was talking about me. As though I wasn't part of the decision anymore. He listened for a few moments, then nodded. "Yes. An assessment would probably help. Thank you." He ended the call. When he turned around, he froze. We looked at each other across the kitchen. Neither of us spoke. Finally, he broke the silence. "Dad, I was going to tell you." I believed him. I really did. But I quietly asked, "Were you going to tell me? Before you made the call? Or afterwards?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. He never answered. He didn't have to. I already knew. That was the first time I felt like a visitor in decisions about my own wife. The assessment was booked for the following week. I wasn't happy about it, but I agreed. Not because I'd changed my mind, because I wanted people to see how hard my wife was fighting. I still believed if they met her, they'd understand why I couldn't let her go. Then, we never made it to the assessment. 3 nights before it was due, I woke up just after 4 in the morning. My side of the bed was empty. I wasn't alarmed. My wife wandered sometimes. I'd usually find her downstairs, looking for a room she'd lived in 40 years ago. I got out of bed. As I walked onto the landing, I saw Fred's partner. She was gently guiding my wife back towards the hallway. "Morning," she whispered. "Morning," I replied. Everything seemed calm. I smiled. "I'll just use the toilet." "Then I'll help you," she nodded. "All right." I took 2 steps into the bathroom. I hadn't even locked the door. Then I heard it. A scream. Not frightened. Agony. I ran out. My wife was lying at the bottom of the staircase. One arm twisted beneath her. Her eyes were open, but she wasn't moving. I dropped to my knees beside her. My hands were shaking so badly. I could barely hold hers. She looked at me and whispered my name, then closed her eyes. I remember shouting for an ambulance. I remember Fred running downstairs. I remember someone pulling me back, telling me not to move her. But everything after that feels like pieces of a nightmare. Even now, I still measure my life in 2 parts. Before those 30 seconds, and after them. The ambulance arrived within minutes. They worked on my wife in the hallway before carefully carrying her outside. I tried to climb into the ambulance with her. A paramedic gently stopped me. "We'll bring you in another vehicle, sir." I looked at him. "She won't know where I am." He placed a hand on my shoulder. "We'll look after her." I remember thinking, that's my job. At the hospital, they ran scan after scan, x-rays, blood tests, questions that seemed to go on forever. My wife drifted in and out of sleep. Sometimes she recognized me. Sometimes she smiled, as though I was just another visitor. Late that afternoon, a doctor asked to speak with us privately. Me, Fred, and a hospital social worker. The doctor's voice was gentle. "Physically, she's fortunate. The injuries could have been much worse." Relief washed over me. Then he carried on. "But we have to think about what happens when she leaves here." I nodded. "She comes home with me." The room fell quiet. The social worker looked down at her notes, then softly asked, "Can you honestly say she's safe at home now?" I opened my mouth, but no words came out. Before I could answer, Fred spoke. "No, just one word. Quiet," respectful, certain. I turned and looked at him. He couldn't meet my eyes. The social worker nodded slowly. Then she said the one word I would hear again and again over the following days. Capacity. They talked about my wife's capacity. Then, without me even noticing, they started talking about mine. Could I cope? Was I exhausted? Was I sleeping? Could I keep her safe? I answered every question honestly, because I thought honesty would help us. I didn't realize every truthful answer I gave was quietly building the case that I could no longer keep the promise I'd made. When that meeting ended, I was still her husband, but for the first time, nobody in that room believed that was enough. The following afternoon, the hospital arranged another meeting. This time, there were no medical updates. It was about what happened next. A care coordinator placed 2 folders on the table. She spoke kindly. There are really 2 realistic options. The first is a live-in carer. My heart lifted. She continued. Someone would move into your home, providing round-the-clock support while allowing your wife to remain in familiar surroundings. Before she could explain the second option, I interrupted. We'll take that. For the first time in days, I felt hope. I looked at Fred, expecting him to smile. Instead, he looked down at the table. The coordinator gently cleared her throat. There is one thing you need to consider. She mentioned the weekly cost. I didn't even let her finish. We'll manage, I said. I spent 30 years building a business. If I have to sell everything I own, my wife is going home. Then Fred finally spoke. His voice was calm, almost too calm. Dad, we can't afford that. I frowned. What do you mean we can't? He looked at me, then quietly said, the business isn't making what it used to. There are loans, tax bills, maintenance. You don't know the full picture anymore. I stared at him. I'd handed him the business because I trusted him. I never imagined there would come a day when he'd use the business I'd built to explain why my wife couldn't come home. The coordinator gently slid the second folder across the table. Residential care. Fred rested his hand on it. Not dramatically, just as though the decision had already settled in his mind. I looked straight at him. You're asking me to break the only promise your mother ever begged me to keep. His eyes filled with tears. Then he whispered, No, Dad. I'm asking you to let someone help her. I shook my head. No. You're asking me to let her wake up somewhere she'll spend every morning wondering why I abandoned her. Nobody spoke. The room became painfully quiet. Then the care coordinator asked the question. That changed everything. If residential care is recommended, will anyone be staying with her during the transition? I answered, before anyone else could. I will. Everyone turned to look at me. I didn't hesitate. If she can't come home, then wherever she goes, that's where I'll live too. I thought I was sacrificing my home. I had no idea. I was about to lose everything else with it. So, here I am, writing this from the little room I now share with my wife. It isn't home, but every morning, before she opens her eyes, I'm the first face she sees. I kept that promise, just not in the way I imagined. The first few weeks, I kept asking Fred when we were going home. He always had an answer. The paperwork isn't finished. The solicitors are sorting things out. Just give me a little more time. Then the phone calls became less frequent. One day, I asked one of the nurses if she could help me check my bank account. I thought there had been some mistake. There wasn't. The business I'd spent 30 years building was gone. The house where my wife and I had raised our son was gone. I later found out Fred and his partner were living there. Before long, her parents were living there too. The same house where my wife and I had celebrated birthdays, Christmases, and every anniversary we were lucky enough to have. Even my wife's jewelry, the pieces we'd collected over a lifetime, slowly disappeared. When I asked Fred about the pearl necklace, he simply said, "Dad, they're only things." Maybe they were, but every one of those things carried a memory, and memories were all my wife had left. Today, I have less than 100 pounds in my pocket. At 59 years old, I own fewer things than I did when I was 19. The difference is, at 19, I still had my future. 3 months have passed. Fred hasn't walked through that door once. Not for me, not for his mother. Sometimes, my wife looks towards the corridor and asks, "Is Fred coming today?" I smile, the same way I always do. And I tell her, maybe tomorrow. A few minutes later, dementia helps her forget she ever asked. I don't have that luxury. I remember every single time. People keep asking me if I regret adopting Fred. My answer has never changed. No, because the little boy who hid behind that chair deserved a family. I just wish the man he became had remembered the people who gave him one. If you've listened to my story this far, don't leave here angry. Life has a way of testing all of us in different ways. But if your mother is still alive, if your father is still alive, don't assume you'll always have another weekend, another birthday, another phone call. Visit them, sit with them, listen to the stories you've already heard 100 times. One day, you'll give anything to hear them tell you those stories just once more. As for me, tomorrow morning, I'll wake up beside the woman I've loved for 40 years. She may not remember my name, but I'll still remember hers. And until my last breath, that will be enough.